Good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm so excited to see all of you as people are going to keep filtering in. So we're just going to keep going and welcome everyone as they enter in. I'm Angie Newsome. I'm the Executive Director of Carolina Public Press. I'm so thrilled to be with you all today on this Thursday in Asheville, where I am, Asheville, North Carolina. It's beautiful. So I'm enjoying some sunshine and getting to spend the lunch hour with all of you. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to tell you what we're going to do today and what to expect, and we'll get going. So as you all know, we're going to be spending an hour today talking about the American Rescue Plan Act. This is such an important topic for us as an organization because we are a nonprofit news organization based in North Carolina. We cover the entire state and we focus on investigative, in-depth reporting, government accountability reporting, and public interest reporting. And we also really focus on the issues that are going overlooked and underreported in our communities, both locally and statewide, of which ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, is a huge one. And so we've been spending the past year, Shelby, who you'll get to meet in just a moment, devoting one reporter to the beat, the ARPA beat. And so we're really excited to share what we learned in hopes that y'all could take it back to your individual newsrooms and do reporting that really impacts and informs local and statewide and national communities. So with that in mind, you might have seen that we're recording this session. We'll send the recording out to all of you. We'll send the supplemental materials out to all of you following the event when we end at around 1 o'clock. So just watch your emails for that, and we'll also post it on our website. You can find all of our reporting about ARPA and everything else that we do at carolinapublicpress.org. We are a nonprofit, and everything you see on our website is free to access and to share. So if your newsrooms are interested in sharing some of the reporting that we've done, either on ARPA or on other issues, we have a content sharing section where you can see how to do that. And we welcome you to do that and share it with your own audiences. So again, really want to welcome all of you. If you could all keep yourself muted until later in the session, that would be terrific. But as we go along, please feel free to use the chat. If you have questions that come up, we have folks on our team that are monitoring the chat that will help get questions to Shelby to answer. So please feel free to do that and say hello to one another. Some of you might know each other too. So please feel free to use that chat capability. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Lopez, who is the Director of Development at Carolina Public Press, to give you some insight into how we even got started with this. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Angie. I'm thrilled to be here and so glad all of you could join us today. Again, as Angie said, I'm Lisa Lopez, Director of Development for CPP. And just to give you a little bit of context, in late 2021, early 2022, we realized that ARPA was coming. And so we approached the Dogwood Health Trust about a potential grant to support a reporting project that would focus on the way ARPA funds were being spent in towns throughout Western North Carolina. We felt that this type of reporting was important. One, because counties, cities, and tribal governments would be receiving millions of dollars to aid communities affected by COVID-19, and Shelby's going to talk about that in a little bit. Two, we knew that community engagement and accountability journalism would help ensure that relief funds filled the gaps, and particularly in underserved minority and rural communities that are facing racial and economic issues. And finally, we recognized that news deserts were becoming and are becoming more prevalent, so especially in rural areas. So we really felt that this was an important project to focus on, and luckily, fortunately, the Dogwood Health Trust agreed with us, and this project was born. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cara Andrade, who will talk a little bit more about ARPA and introduce Shelby. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So Hi, everybody. My name is Cara Andrade. My pronouns are she, her, ella in Spanish, and I'm the editor-in-chief for Carolina Public Press based in Durham. Thank God the sun came out today. And as Andy said, our news team covers the state. We have someone, Shelby, who covers Western North Carolina. You'll be hearing more from her today. And we also have Ben Sessoms here, who's our reporter for the eastern part of the state. I really want to thank you for your time and interest in this topic. I want to reiterate what Lisa said. Covering ARPA is very important, and we felt it was very important because it helps to create more access to information that was really needed by different parts of the state. And since all counties, municipalities, and residents had to access federal relief funds, it was really important that people got the information they needed. Like that would be like the when, the where, the how of how this relief program worked and how to access it. And it's one of those situations where not having accurate information does directly impact communities. And our project included original reporting, as Angie mentioned, that was published on our website, and we had content sharing partners. Anybody could republish. We also piloted a texting news to text message service. And we did this because our larger goal was filling news and information gaps that are combined by a combination of like news deserts and inaccessible broadband in Western North Carolina. So, Shelby will be able to talk to you more about that. But so without further ado, I would like to introduce CBP journalist Shelby Harris. She's a reporter who's been covering Western North Carolina for a couple of years now. She has a master's degree in journalism and strategic media from the University of Memphis. She has a bachelor's in English from Mississippi College. And previous to being at CPP, Shelby, what happened? Sorry. Previous to being at CPP, Shelby worked as a reporter for the Asheville Citizen-Times, and she covered breaking news and education. She was at the Daily Times, Maryville, Tennessee. She reported on local government, and she lives in Buncombe County. Shelby, take it away.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Yeah, that's me, all of that. I'm so grateful that everybody wants to hear about how to report on ARPA, because I know it may not be the juiciest topic from the outside, but it really is once you dive into it. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what ARPA is, how I did it, and some suggestions if y'all want to look into like really doing a deep dive into ARPA. So as everybody has said, we started this project in January. And at first, I always say that I thought there was no way to produce 12 months worth of copy about this, but I was very wrong. If you decide to look into ARPA, there will be bottomless stories. I assure you that. Okay. So we can go to the next slide, Ellen. I don't know. Maybe I'm seeing things differently than everybody else. Okay. So ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, it became law in March 2021. It's COVID recovery money, which means it was intended to recover people, communities from the COVID-19 pandemic. And the other part of it that people often forget is that it was also supposed to prepare us if something like this were to happen in the future. And so the money that was given to different communities was distributed according to population. Most of the time for big cities, there were some other things thought about depending on a lot of things, but for the most part, it was all distributed according to population. North Carolina got $5.7 million, and all ARPA has to be designated by December 2024 and spent by December 2026. So it puts this little time crunch on the spending and the planning and making all that happen. So next, we'll go to the next slide, Ellen. Yeah, and I think people are saying in the chat that I'm seeing the presenter view as well, not just this slide. I saw somebody just say that. So as Angie said, Lisa said, Cara said, I think everybody did, that we decided that we were going to look into ARPA, specifically in Western North Carolina, just to see how the funds were being spent. The main goal was to tell people how this money that was intended to serve them was being spent and get them to engage in that process. So obviously that's the goal of journalism always, is to tell people what they need to know to be able to participate. And that was what we wanted to do about this funding stream. So I went for it. Next slide. So my coverage area, there were 63 towns and cities and 18 counties. I would have loved to have written a story about every single one of those, but I am not Superman. But I did come up with about 36 stories in 10, 11 months. And sometimes I would lump together, like if you'll see, I did some that were kind of these overarching views of the whole situation, and then I would zoom in on some. So if you'll see the bottom right, it's about, well, I guess not that one, but one of those is about Brevard specifically using their money for stormwater. So I would either zoom in and pick a specific spending, or I would zoom out and take it from a larger perspective. We can go to the next slide. So this is what I have to say about covering ARPA, because ARPA is very complex, it's very complicated, and it is a huge pot of money. So it can be very tricky. And I love this meme because I have been both Buzz and Woody through this reporting, truly. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So the first thing you need to know is you need to know what you're talking about. Obviously, we know this with journalism in general, but you need to know what the money is, how it can be spent, what it can be used for, just know all the basics, because more than likely when you get on a phone call and you say, hey, I would like to talk about the American Rescue Plan Act, people will immediately say, oh, well, did you know that ARPA was passed for this intention or this intention? And it's nice if you can just be like, yes, I've got all of that. So now let's talk about our plan specifically. So it's good to just know the basics going into interviews and things like that. Next. And then this is just the greatest meme in the history of journalist memes, but especially with ARPA, because while municipalities and counties are required to report that spending to the federal government isn't always the fastest to publish those reports. So you have to find them. Big counties would have, like Buncombe County, Henderson County had whole websites devoted to their ARPA spending and what they were doing with the money, how they were using it. Smaller places, Lake Lure, Brevard, like I just said, they didn't have whole websites. And so what I did was I poured through meeting agendas and meeting minutes. And if I got lucky, I could, hit Control F and type in ARPA or the American Rescue Plan Act, and it would take it to me. But that was rare. I really just had to sit for hours and sift through these meetings until I found something about ARPA. And then if I couldn't find anything there, I would just straight up call them and be like, hi, I'm writing about ARPA. How are y'all spending the money? And they would usually just tell me right there, because it's a big deal. They all know what you're talking about, and they all typically want to talk about it. Next slide. So this is the most important question, or the most important slide, of course, is to ask the right questions about ARPA. Why was this project selected? What else could it have been used for? Who will be impacted? And most of all, does this project accomplish ARPA's goal of recovering the community and preparing it for another disaster? Of course, you probably don't want to ask these, overarching, very philosophical questions exactly, but you can, play with them. The point is that pushing people to explain the projects that they're choosing to use this federal taxpayer money on eventually gets to the crux of the purpose of the project, I would say. Next slide. Okay, so this is a quote from President Biden right after he signed the American Rescue Plan Act. This historic legislation is about rebuilding the backbone of this country and giving people in this nation, working people and middle-class folks, the people who built this country, a fighting chance. So I wrote this down and put this above my desk when I was writing all of my ARPA stories and doing all of this reporting, because I thought it was really important to remember that this was money for the people, straight up. And I could dance around it and all of that, and we could get lost in all the numbers, but I needed to come back to this, that we just went through this really hard time and this money was supposed to help. So how is it doing that? Next. The reason that I think that we need to focus especially on impact when writing about ARPA is because ARPA, like I said, may not be the most juicy topic from the outside. And the New York Times wrote this great article about how that's likely because a lot of the projects are invisible. So you can't really see, I don't know, like plans for a sewer system. I think that's the example I've used, but you can see your street being torn up, right? When that happens, but not beforehand. So because these projects are invisible, a lot of people don't know about them and don't care about them and don't know that this giant amount of money is available for their community. So it's good to look at the historical situations like Lake Lure, for example. That's a small town in Western North Carolina. They had a really, really antiquated sewer system that they've been waiting for money to fix. And then here comes this money. So a lot of my story focused on how much that project was needed. So looking at the historical needs, the needs of the actual community, and how it will benefit the community in the way that ARPA is supposed to is very important to do. Next. And the biggest question I think you should probably ask is, what is the money not being spent on? I always say an ARPA dollar spent on one project is an ARPA dollar not spent on another project. So what about the one that wasn't funded? Why not? Is there any more appropriate way we could have spent this money? Do you think that this is a way that the community would like this money to be spent? Is it helping progress this town, this county, the communities further? Is it filling any gaps in societal and structural issues? These are really important questions to ask because choosing where to spend the money is a big, big deal because it means a lot of other things are not going to be funded, especially with large chunks of money. Next slide. And then again, just coming back to, this is money for the people. And so you have to talk to the people. So you have to find a face for these articles. Like I said, we may not be able to see the plans for a sewer sister, what would a sewer sister be? A sewer system coming, but we see our road torn apart, right? Go talk to the people on that street. I literally did that exact thing in Brevard for that stormwater story. As I called a business on that street and said, how do you feel about this? This is money for the people. And so you have to talk to the people about it. We can go to the next one. Yeah, and I think that's everything. Just kind of very, very summarized about my year with ARPA. I learned so much about it, and it's such an important piece of legislation. And I'm so grateful that everybody is curious about it, or everybody here is curious. And we're going to take questions, but if anybody has any questions that we don't get to, y'all are welcome to reach out to me. I will respond and help as best as I can, or connect you with who can help better than me. So yeah, thank y'all.
Shelby, this is Angie. I just wondered if you could drill down into how you actually found out the amount of money that was being designated to specific communities and counties. I mean, it took a lot of work from you. So if you can drill down into that, and then how you've been tracking it over time in terms of expenditures.
Sure, yeah, the nitty gritty. We talked about the thoughtful side of it. So to get the total amount that Western North Carolina and the individual municipalities were, unfortunately, ARPA doesn't really have like one database that just has it all. So I had to pull it from multiple places. So just specifically, I used Treasury, I used the North Carolina County Commissioners Association, the North Carolina League of Municipalities, and after I pulled, county data from some, city data from some, and then state data from some, I was able to have a full look at where everybody was getting their money, but it wasn't as easy as downloading a spreadsheet from Treasury. And how I tracked it was a lot of Google alerts, basically, but then also just going back and checking frequently those meetings. County commission meetings are every month. So I would just check back after the meetings and read the meeting documents and see if anything happened. But also what happened when I would reach out to people, I would say, please let me know if something changes. And usually they would let me know. But to track the spending, I would just check back in with the governments. And then once the quarterly reports and such were finally released from Treasury, I would pull those. But it was mostly just staying on top of small town government meeting minutes and pulling those numbers and those projects and creating my own database.
And we had a great question that came in on the chat, which was, when was or is the money being distributed to the counties and local municipalities?
That's a great question. So it began being distributed in May 2021. I think it was all out, like all to the municipalities by August 2021. And that was called the first tranche. And then I loved the word tranche. I'd never heard that before. I don't know why, but it's used very commonly in government. And then the second tranche came exactly a year later. So you got half the money beginning in May 2021 and the second half of the money in May 2022, beginning in May 2022.
And so I know from your reporting, having edited you and talked with you throughout the year, there's a lot of questions about allocations of the money. You did a lot of analysis about where it was actually going. Can you give some insight kind of overall about where you saw it going, where it wasn't going? And then talk about the allocation versus actually the expenditures. Those are two different things. So kind of drill down into that and really explain that process.
Yeah, so I think we thought that ARPA was going to be a lot more complicated than it was. And I mean, it's still very complicated until Treasury released their final rules, which within their final rules, which were released almost a year after the legislation was passed, it said that towns, counties, municipalities could claim as much as $10 million ARPA dollars as revenue loss. And that meant that that money moved from the general ARPA money to their operating budget, and they could use it for essentially any purpose. They still had to report it back. But that bucket, that revenue loss bucket, that's how most counties and municipalities, at least in Western North Carolina, use their money, is they took the ARPA and they put it into their operating budget. And that sounds a little like, are we sure that that was the best idea? But what that meant was that you have $6 million more in your operating budget now. So that offsets the cost of, the entire EMS department or the cost of the sewer reconstruction. So most of the time, to prevent having a ton of government oversight and having to comply with state and federal guidelines, they would just claim this money as revenue loss and then do the projects as normal. The second biggest place that I saw people spending money was on broadband expansion, which makes a lot of sense because the purpose was to recover from the pandemic and prepare in case something else like this happens. And everybody said that the pandemic really drew to light this digital divide, that kids who live in rural areas may not have access to broadband internet and couldn't go to school. It made it very obvious as the world was switching. So a lot of towns and cities moved their money to pay for broadband. And that also was a complicated state and federal process, but it's an outstanding amount of money. I can't think of the figure off the top of my head of money that's going to broadband expansion to put fiber in rural areas. So those would be the two biggest places that money were spent. I was surprised to see not a lot spent on vaccine clinics and testing clinics and stuff. And I guess maybe I jumped into this, or maybe it was passed right as COVID was kind of, we weren't pushing the vaccines as much anymore. But I thought there would be more of that. And I was surprised at the number of nonprofits that the bigger counties chose to fund with this money. But I was surprised to see that there was less directly COVID type projects.
Right. And y'all are, there's some great questions coming in on the chat, Shelby, so I'll start asking some of those too. Thomas asked, in your reporting, have you found any examples of ARPA funding being spent in ways outside of the allowed scopes?
So I've not And I don't think we're going to very much because there is that revenue loss category, which basically means that they can spend the money how they want within their budget. It doesn't have to really fall into those categories for ARPA anymore. So I've not seen anybody break the rules. And I don't think we will see a lot of that as we have with past recovery money, just because they kind of worked in that very flexible wiggle room with that revenue loss. I have seen things that maybe I thought it's a little unsavory, but nobody has broken the rules. I haven't seen anything like that. I think we all kind of expected to see. So that's good. Good question.
Yeah, and along those same lines from WTKF, thanks for this. Is there a requirement from both federal and state governments to approve the use of the money?
So no, it doesn't like go up the pike to get approved. It would just be approved by the governing body of the locality that got the money. So like the Buncombe County Commission would be in charge of that, but they don't have to like send it off to the state to stamp off an approval of a project unless there are like state funds coming in, like all those unlesses. But typically, no, they don't have to ask for approval. If they break the rules, they'll get a giant audit in a couple of years, but no, they don't have to. They do have to submit annual or quarterly reports where they submit their spending, but they don't have to get it approved before they do it.
And maybe I think one thing that you're perhaps alluding to is the participation by community members in deciding where the money is going. Are you seeing or have you seen any of that? Or do you find that it's really elected officials and public officials are making those decisions with or without community input?
What a complicated question, because I don't think that very many governments are like hosting forums for people to come vocalize how they think ARPA should be spent. But I think the community leaders are maybe thinking about past conversations they've had with constituents or other situations like that. But I actually have been pretty disappointed to see a lot of places not having any kind of resources about it. I feel really discouraged when people would never even have heard of this money and then tell me that they would have had opinions on how it ought to be spent. I think there should have been a lot of like community, what do they call them? Like town halls where they could chat about this, because I think that government officials, and obviously I'm not a government official. I'm not looking at all the books, and I know that the citizens aren't, but I think it would have been beneficial to maybe look at the books alongside the citizens so that they could have a say in the money. And I didn't see that as much as I thought I would.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so many great questions coming in. Thank you, everybody. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. Luckily, we have a good chunk of time to do that, so keep them coming. So I'm sorry, I don't know who asked this, but it's a really good one. What were your conversations with local governments like, Shelby? Did they balk at the idea of prioritizing impact and equity? Did you talk at all about transparency and community engagement issues? That's related to what I just asked you, but I know you've had some interesting interactions. I don't know if you want to tell some of the stories of what you experienced, but yeah, that's the question.
Because I know that it's another reporter asking that question, I know, like, I think I know. So the conversations would go, they usually presented it to me, they would present it to their, fellow commissioners and things. And then I would often ask the question, and I would phrase it like this. I would say, what would you say if somebody said that this isn't the best way to spend the money, or that maybe we should spend it on fixing the sidewalks on Main Street? And they would usually come back. I can think of 3 times that this happened, that they'd come back and they'd say, everybody will always have opinions about how money should be spent. And it does take a lot of work and a lot of work to engage community members in money-making decisions. So those conversations would they would veer on the defensive side where they're like, no, we know our community and we know, and who am I to come in and say like, are you sure this is the best way to spend the money? They always said that they were, interested in equity and the impact and helping the community through this, and how opening up funds for the government does help the community and things like that. And though they may not see the way that these funds are helping, they might be helping. We got a lot of those kinds of statements. But I wouldn't say they gawked at that. I think it was just, if government gets a giant gift of money and they're like, oh, well, this is what we want to spend it on, we figured it out, and this reporter is asking us about it, but we figured it out 6 months ago. I hope that answers that question.
Great. Thanks, Shelby. Tag teaming with Angie here. We've got a question from Moss. What have you seen related to funding broadband internet access? And in my county, that's where a lot of the ARPA money is going. So I'm curious to see if there's if that's in a lot of the other Western counties as well.
Yeah, I would love to know what county you're from.
It's well, I think Moss put it. It's Watauga County.
Watauga, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually just right outside of my coverage area, but it's definitely still Western. Everybody, all the 18 counties that I covered except one, used at least some of their money toward broadband expansion. That was a huge priority. And also, so the way they did it was submitting a grant application, or internet providers would submit a grant application, and the county would match their ARPA funds with that application, and then the state would add money to that. And if the county added some of their ARPA money to the application, then their application was scored higher, and so they were more likely to get broadband expansion money. So that was the case in 17 out of 18 of the counties. And I think I wrote a story about broadband, and I think, what do you say, like 95 out of the 100 counties would get some of the great grant money. That might not be entirely accurate. What's in my story is accurate. What I'm saying, recounting it might not be entirely.
It's a lot of numbers to remember. From Wendy, is it legal to be paying a broadband provider to come into counties and towns? I've actually wondered this too as well.
So North Carolina has a lot of really, I don't want to say crazy, but we have some broadband laws, and so paying the internet provider would be like that grant. So I guess in that way they're kind of paying them with ARPA money to come in, but I don't think it's so much that, I honestly don't know if just under normal conditions, not with ARPA, if that's what you're asking, if like a county can just pay, I don't know. But I know that with ARPA, it went through this grant process where the county just put money with the internet provider and then they came.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. From Dan in Fresno land, we have seen some expenditures go to nonprofits for their revenue loss. Most recently, a local rodeo festival. Have you observed this in North Carolina?
I don't know that I've seen money go toward nonprofit revenue loss. Maybe it is, and that's just more like within their line items on their budget that I don't know. But for the most part, I just understood that the ARPA funds were going toward operational costs of these nonprofits. I have seen that a lot. And obviously nonprofits lost money during the pandemic. So I guess revenue loss in that form, but I think that's interesting if they logged giving that money as revenue loss, even though it's to a nonprofit. That's interesting to me, but I don't know how. Yeah.
I think there's a story there. Thanks, Dan.
That sounds that sounds good to me.
From Hannah Lee, what happens if a town or municipality's finances are being controlled by LGC? LGC being the Local Government Commission. Have you noticed any difference in the usage of ARPA funds?
I've not. No.
If I can add, Shelby, I don't think we don't have that type of control in North Carolina.
No, I was just thinking like regional councils of government.
Yes, we do have those. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so like Angie was saying, we have regional councils of government, which are not like a governing body, and they would offer advice to counties about how to use ARPA money. But I can't think of like a big difference between the counties that use their kind of resources and the counties that didn't, between what they spent their money on. But yeah, we don't, like Angie said, we don't really, just the regional councils.
Okay, those are the last of the questions. If you have any questions, please add them to your chat. We'll read them out. I have a question, Shelby. I know from one of the stories, so we did the tip sheets, amazing tip sheets in both English and Spanish. A lot of our reporting was translated. There weren't that many resources for Spanish-speaking communities. Did you find that there wasn't that much for Spanish-speaking communities to be able to access ARPA information?
I think unfortunately, North Carolina state government doesn't have a lot of Spanish speaking resources for a lot of its services. And I definitely saw that with ARPA. Even just some stuff, sometimes there was a good, I can't think of specific websites, but sometimes there would be translated resources, but sometimes there wouldn't be. And I think as far as my coverage area, I only saw like one specific outreach towards the Spanish speaking population about the money. And so no, I don't think that, I think we kind of failed there too, providing resources in other languages so that people could know about it.
More story ideas. Here's another question.
That's my opinion though. Well, obviously there's no fact about it.
Can you elaborate on the timeline going forward? What are the milestones we need to know about?
Well, as far as milestones now, it'll just be those quarterly reports that are due. And then the end of 2024, all the money has to be appropriated. So it has to be like in a plan. And then it has to be spent in the next 2 years. And that sounds like a long time. So as far as milestones, that's it. And that does sound like a long time, but if you're a big city and you're redoing your sewer line or a lot of sewer lines, that's a 4-year project. And we have to figure out how to spend the money 2 years before that. So we got to get moving. That was a lot of people's complaints about this at the beginning of the timeline. But yeah, from here on out, we're just looking at those reports and the ending dates, I think.
Great, thanks, Shelby. From Susie, I'm a policy advocate crashing this meeting. Thanks, Susie, welcome. And have read every article published as part of this project. I am so thankful for CPP and Shelby's work. We're working with local advocates all across the state to advance equitable spending priorities and community engagement, and would love to connect any interested reporters to local folks we're connected with. I've also done a lot of summarizing and translating the complexity of this work, so I'm really happy to be a resource if that's helpful. And she shares her email address in the thread, but you'll see it in the chat. She's from the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. Thanks, Susie.
Thank you, Susie.
Be a great resource. From Annie, what's the best way to access the reports? Have any Western North Carolina counties not submitted the reports? I recall looking for Rutherford County and wasn't able to find it.
So you only have to submit, how often you have to submit a report is related to your population. So only counties with a population of 250,000 people have to report them quarterly. And then I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it's biannually for the smaller ones. But again, those are lagged coming out. So I don't know Rutherford, they don't have that many people. So they wouldn't have to do as many reports as say Buncombe would. I have to think about the populations of the counties.
Okay, got another one. So just to be clear, there is time for counties and towns to still decide, right?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, but they better figure it out. You know, if they're planning these projects, like, yeah, I mean, you've got 2 years, like, yes, but they still have time, technically.
Years flies by, everybody, as we've seen with COVID, right? Any other questions, comments? We've got a little bit of time left.
They have time on paper, but in my like anecdotal view of looking at these projects and stuff, they probably better figure it out pretty soon.
Shelby, there's another question that came in. What's been some of the public feedback and general interest to your ARPA funding stories? We heard from Susie, but can you talk a little bit about what you've heard from folks? And I can certainly share what I've heard too.
Well, you're welcome to do that. I've been really surprised at how many people, like community members, have reached out about this, or just read one of my articles and then reached out and said, well, what's happening in Yancey County? Just something like as simple as that. And that makes me very happy that people are reading it and doing that. I've gotten a lot of, like Susie, I've gotten a lot of kind of reach outs in that way, that people wanting to like change policy and do things like that. And they've wanted to ask me about those situations, but the community has been very, very engaged. I just, like a tiny story, a woman called me and she was just so frustrated. And she was just, because she had read my story about how the money was being spent. And she was like, I didn't know anything about it. And then she called me back a couple of hours later and said, I have been on the phone with the mayor's office all day trying to figure this out. And it was the best feeling. I was like, yes, that's why I wanted, because she didn't like how the money was being spent. And so she called up there and she called me back. And yeah, so community engagement has been surprising. I think surprising. I didn't expect it this much, but people are here. People care.
Yeah, same. If I could just say, as the executive director, of hearing from people reaching out to me personally and saying much of the same thing, and saying also thanking us for being on top of it and doing it over time versus doing perhaps like a one-off story here or there. And everything from the very local stories that Shelby did, like how this money was going to impact a farmer's market, for example, to all the way looking at the state, at the state level, like where doing that very hard analysis about the buckets of money and where municipalities and public governments are putting the money and making those decisions. So if I could just thank Shelby for looking at it from the macro and the micro point of view, because it really tells the story of government policy priorities, and then how it's going to impact you and me. To your point, the sewer system on my street, or the farmers market where I'm going, or to Kara's point that and Shelby's point that there were lots of people in our communities for whom this information was largely inaccessible, particularly if you're immigrant or Spanish speaking or other language, other folks who speak other languages in North Carolina. We did our best in providing and translating everything that Shelby wrote. And we also really tried to, and I know Lindsay's on here, I wonder if she could just spring in this on her, but maybe just talk for just a few minutes about how we also try to get it to people who do have general information access issues. I mean, that's where our texting program came in, because we really felt that getting people to our website is one thing, but what if you aren't even able to do that? Because, arguably some of those folks are the most impacted by the COVID pandemic. So if Lindsay's still on, or even Shelby, if she's not, Shelby, if you want to talk a little bit about the texting. Yeah.
Sure. So another part of this ARPA investigation was a project that I've been working on for the last year, that was funded in part by the Dogwood Foundation and also by the Google News Initiative, to look at how folks in rural North Carolina get their news and information. So we dug deep into that topic, just rural information, news deserts, but also with an eye toward ARPA and trying to communicate about the investigation that we were doing, that Shelby was doing. So we did a survey that was pretty comprehensive. We reached about 1,500 people in the state who responded to our survey. They were all rural folks, rural and small town people who had interest in, communicating to us about how they got news and information. And out of that project came a text message newsroom that we trialed, where we gathered phone numbers from people. Mostly it's all opt-in, because that's how you have to do this legally. So folks gave us their phone numbers, and we would send them updates about all of Shelby's reporting. We had really good retention rates on that. And we have a little under 200 people who are still signed up for those text messages.
That's great. Thanks, Lindsay. Shelby and Cara, please jump in. I see a few of you can't message everyone directly, but you're messaging directly. So thanks for doing that. Josh Bergeron asked, what are some of the most compelling story ideas you found during reporting, and how did you find them, Shelby?
So I'm glad you said that, because I was actually going to jump in after you mentioned the farmers market, Angie, and talk about that to answer your question. And it just so happens that I will also answer your question. The most interesting stories, and I think the most impactful stories, were when I took them really small. So for example, I wrote my favorite story about ARPA that I wrote was about the Mills River Farm Market. It's a small farmers market in Henderson County, and Mills River is a small town, and they're using a portion of their ARPA money to supplement SNAP benefits at the farmers market. So that means if you go in with like $10 worth of SNAP benefits, you can come out with $20 worth of food. And it just consisted of me talking to the people who run the farmers market, and they were delightful. But I thought that was just a really interesting way to tell that story, that like this is the money, and this is how it's actually affecting people right here in the farmers market. And then I was going to say another one that and how did I get the idea for that story? I think I read Mills River Farm Market or Mills River Town Council meeting agendas. Or I might have been talking to the Henderson, y'all will have to forgive me, this has been a whole year. I might have been talking to the Henderson County manager, and he told me about what the town was doing. And that's how I got that idea. You can ask like on the phone, like, oh, how have you heard how other people are spending their money? And it would kind of lead me other places. Then I wrote another one about Buncombe County nonprofit, Babies Need Bottoms. And it was about how ARPA money was going to fund this nonprofit to get babies diapers. And I got to tell the story through that lens, and through like funding preschool. I got to talk about kids and kind of get in there through that lens. So those would be some of my favorite ones that I've written. And I think the majority of those just came from talking to someone else and them saying, well, what have you heard about what so-and-so is doing? The nonprofit one I'm talking about, well, that was Buncombe County, so they probably had it on their website. But the story ideas really just kind of came from word of mouth or reading these documents.
Thanks, Shelby. From Ivy, what happens if local governments don't spend the money by 2026? Some officials are worried they'll get blowback with future grant applications if they don't spend all of ARPA.
Yeah, the only stipulation that we know so far is that it goes back to the federal government, but I wouldn't be surprised if you were going to get in trouble if you didn't. There was an option for counties for you not to take the ARPA money. Like you could deny it, but I haven't heard about anywhere doing that.
I was going to say,
that
would be a story in itself too.
well, the problem was, and the reason that people were saying that people might, or towns might reject the money, is because they don't have the staff to manage it, which was something that I ran into a lot. They were saying, we have one finance director with a $6 million annual budget, and we just got $5 million out of the blue. How are we gonna? So that's why they said that.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. Ellen, do we have time for one more question? We got one more question from Wendy. Okay, I got the thumbs up. Metronet received $2 million of ARPA funds to lay cables through at least 30,000 homes. Public utilities are overworked, and now they have to take away from their normal workload. The administrative cost too and labor is overwhelming workers. Thoughts, Shelby?
Thoughts? Sure. Yeah, I'm curious where that is. You can email me though, Wendy. I would love to learn more about this.
Interesting.
That is interesting.
Okay, Ellen, I think I got the sign here. We're at time, but I want to thank everybody for a really rigorous question and answer period. Thank you, Shelby. You've imparted a lot of knowledge to all of us.
I'm so glad that you all had so many questions. Thanks for listening to me and supporting us and caring about this work. I hope.
Oh, sorry, Shelby. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying, I hope we keep up the coverage, like we as a universal journalism sphere.
Right, same. There's so many stories out there to be done, to be cleared. There's still time for, and Shelby said this, there's still time for municipalities to decide where this money is going. Those decisions are still being made in some locations. I think in Shelby's particular coverage area, almost everybody's made those decisions, even though the money has not been spent. So those are two different things. So you can also try, in addition to the decision making, you can track expenditures, where they're at, where the money is actually going to. And some of you had some examples of where that's actually happening. But so there is still time for that to happen. And then of course, afterwards, the impact of those expenditures. I can think of lots of questions and story ideas about really drilling down about what the impact was. So thank you, Shelby, so much. There's been questions coming in about whether we've ended the reporting project. Technically, yes. However, we're going, our main mission is to do investigative, in-depth reporting, government accountability reporting. So we are going to still be following it. Likely not to the intense nature that Shelby's been devoting to it over the past year, but we're still going to be covering it and watching out for it. We're still available. If you all have story ideas, you want to collaborate with us, please reach out. There's lots to be done still. And there's lots of community engagement opportunities around this topic as well, from news organizations and policy organizations and others who care about public policy and government expenditures. So thank you all for being a part of it. Again, you will be getting the recording of this delivered to you, the presentation that Shelby had. You can also find the tip sheets in both English and Spanish on our website, all of Shelby's reporting. And she also shares like how to get the reports on there too. So if you are trying to figure this out, how to actually do it, please take a look at that and reach out to us. You can contact us at news@carolinapublicpress.org if there's questions that we didn't answer. If you get into it and you find like, oh, I really want to know how they did X, please reach out. And you can find all of it at carolinapublicpress.org. And we are a nonprofit news organization. Really appreciate all of you being with us today and supporting us. And we send our support back to you all in your communities. I really want to thank Shelby so much for taking a year and working on this. She came in and just hit the ground running and really filled an information gap in North Carolina itself, and especially in Western North Carolina, for which most of the region is rural and underserved. So I really appreciate you, Shelby, for all your work on that. I also want to thank Ellen Acancia, who is going to be leaving Carolina Public Press, for organizing the event and all of these amazing events that we've had over the past several years. Really going to miss her. So if anyone's out there would like to join our organization, we're going to have some job announcements pretty soon. So keep a look on that. And again, really just appreciate you all and hope you have a great day. And thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Lisa, you can stop the recording. You're good with that?
We'll do, yeah.
Cool.